The conference room felt smaller than usual. The air was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and cold tension. I stood near the back, my back against the painted wall, while my boss, Marcus Thorne, stood at the head of the long table. He was leaning forward, his hands flat on the polished wood. He looked like a man in total control. Then, he said my name. It wasn't a call for input or a friendly greeting. It was a cold verdict that cut through the murmurs of the executives. He explained the project's massive failure and pinned it squarely on my work. He spoke about missed deadlines and ignored risks as if he were reading a factual history. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, heavy with judgment and disappointment. My stomach dropped into a hollow pit, but I kept my jaw still. I looked down at the report in front of me. I realized he was lying, and the trap was set. I did not speak. I did not cry out in my own defense, and I certainly did not interrupt his polished performance. I simply let him finish destroying my professional reputation, sentence by painful sentence. Around the table, my coworkers began to avert their eyes. I could see them mentally distancing themselves from me, the person who had apparently almost ruined the company's biggest account. My hands were folded tightly under the table, hidden from view. My nails bit into my palms, so hard I thought they might draw blood, but I used that sharp pain to stay focused. Silence became my first weapon. If I had argued then, I would have looked defensive and guilty. By staying quiet, I became a blank canvas for his lies. Marcus eventually stopped talking and offered a small, sympathetic shrug to the board members. The meeting ended shortly after, and he flashed me a quick, winning smile. This was the exact moment my career almost ended. It was a Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., a time usually reserved for progress updates, not public executions. However, this was also the moment Marcus sealed his own fate without even knowing it. He thought he had found the perfect scapegoat in me. He assumed I was too timid to fight back and too disorganized to have proof. My name is Megan Walker. I am 32 years old, and I have spent the last 5 years being the person who makes everyone else look good. I was always the one in the background, fixing errors and smoothing over rough edges for the team. Marcus relied on that. He believed my loyalty was a form of blindness. He was about to find out that being observant is not the same as being weak. This is how I let the truth slowly bury him. To understand how we got here, you have to look back 3 months earlier. At that time, I was known as the most dependable person at the office. I was the fixer. If a client was angry, I called them. If a spreadsheet was broken, I stayed until midnight to rebuild it from scratch. While others took long lunches and shared credit for my ideas, I just kept my head down and worked. Marcus noticed this quality early on. He started calling me his right hand, but looking back, I realized he was just measuring me for the blame he planned to shift later. He decided to use my reputation for hard work as a shield for his own lack of effort. One rainy afternoon, he called me into his office. He looked stressed, rubbing his temples while pointing at a new, massive project folder. He told me I was the only one he trusted. The project Marcus gave me was a total nightmare from the start. The deadline was physically impossible, requiring 6 months of work to be squeezed into 8 weeks. On top of that, the resources I needed were suddenly missing. Every time I asked for more staff or a bigger budget, Marcus would just wave a hand dismissively. He would lean back in his chair and tell me to just make it work. He told me that my creativity was the company's greatest asset and that I didn't need a large team to succeed. I knew it was a setup even then, but I was determined to prove him wrong. I worked through every weekend, documenting every hurdle I encountered. I kept a detailed log of every missing resource and every denied request. The report I was building slowly became more than just project data. It was becoming my secret insurance policy. As the weeks passed, I became obsessed with the paper trail. I made sure every single revision I made to the project plan was timestamped in our system. I didn't just accept verbal instructions anymore. I followed up every conversation with a summary email. Every approval I received from Marcus was logged and backed up in 3 different digital locations. I saved every warning I sent him about the shrinking timeline and the technical glitches we were facing. At the time, I didn't fully realize why I was being so careful. Maybe it was just my nature to be precise, or maybe a small voice in the back of my mind was telling me that Marcus wasn't a leader worth following. Regardless, I archived every single piece of communication. I was building a fortress of facts, brick by brick, while Marcus was busy playing golf with the senior partners and taking long weekends. 1 week before the big presentation, Marcus did something that changed everything. He asked for one last small change to the final report. He walked over to my desk, leaning over my shoulder with a cold smile. He said he wanted to polish the executive summary to make it pop for the board. I stepped away to get a glass of water, leaving him at my computer. When I returned, he was gone. I checked the file and realized he had rewritten a key section himself. He had deleted my clear recommendations about the safety protocols and the budget risks. Then, he saved it and submitted the final version to the server under my name. I felt a cold, sharp stone settle in my chest as I read his words. He had stripped away all the warnings I had worked so hard to include. I immediately saved a private copy he didn't know existed. Predictably, the project collapsed within 48 hours of the launch. The clients were beyond furious. The software crashed, the budget overruns were massive, and the safety protocols Marcus deleted caused a major technical delay. Leadership at the company went into a full-blown panic. I watched from my cubicle as senior managers marched in and out of the executive wing with grim faces. Suddenly, all the meetings about the project's future were scheduled without me. I was the lead on paper, but I was being treated like a ghost. Marcus wouldn't even look at me when he passed my desk. I could hear him through the thin walls of his office, his voice rising in fake frustration as he spoke to the partners. He was already spinning the story. He was setting the stage for the meeting where everything would eventually explode in my face. That brings us back to the conference room for the public execution. Marcus was speaking smoothly now, his voice full of a practiced, fake sadness. He explained to the board of directors how I had ignored the risks he supposedly warned me about. He claimed I had caused the delays by being disorganized and that I had hidden the budget issues from him until it was too late. He looked at me with a piteous expression, as if he were mourning a student who had failed a simple test. I didn't flinch. I didn't show anger or even surprise. I sat there like a statue, watching him dig a hole that was getting deeper with every word he uttered. I knew exactly when he crossed the line into total fabrication. He was so confident in his own charm that he forgot I was the one who actually built the system he was trashing. Then, Marcus made a fatal mistake. He referenced a version of the report that never actually existed in the official archives. He started quoting figures and missed warnings that he claimed were in my initial drafts. He was trying to prove I was negligent from day one. However, the figures he used were from the secret edits he had made on my computer when I went to get water. He couldn't have seen those figures unless he had altered the document himself, because I had never included them in any shared version. I felt my pulse slow down to a steady, calm rhythm. He was so busy lying that he didn't realize he had just admitted to tampering with the data. He thought he was being clever, but he was actually handing me the key to his own undoing. He had no idea that I had the original metadata. After the meeting ended, I didn't confront him in the hallway. I didn't go to his office to demand an apology or a retraction. Instead, I walked up to him and thanked him for the feedback in front of the remaining executives. Marcus looked surprised for a second, then his chest puffed out with pride. He told me he was glad I was taking it like a professional and that maybe we could find a less demanding role for me in the future. I let him relax. I wanted him to feel like he had successfully moved the target from himself to me. Overconfidence is always much louder than guilt, and Marcus was practically screaming with it. He spent the rest of the day bragging to his friends on the phone about how he had handled the crisis. He thought the danger had passed, but the truth was just starting to wake up. During the following week, I began to notice a very clear pattern. Now that I was looking for it, I saw that Marcus had done this before. I talked to a few former employees who had left the company quietly. They told me stories of how Marcus would take the credit for their successes and then publicly blame them for his own strategic errors. These were quieter people who hadn't kept records. They had just been crushed by his influence and forced to move on to other jobs with ruined reputations. No one had ever documented his behavior because they were too busy trying to survive his management. I started connecting the dots, mapping out his history of blame shifting across different departments. I realized I wasn't just fighting for my own job. I was fighting a system he had perfected. Then, HR sent me a formal request for my project files. The Human Resources Department wanted my full documentation for clarity regarding the project failure. I knew Marcus had probably prompted this, hoping they would find evidence of my incompetence in my notes. I didn't panic. I spent the evening organizing my files. I sent them exactly what they asked for: the final report, the draft history, and the email archives. I included the technical metadata that showed exactly when and where each change was made. I didn't add any angry comments or accusations. I just sent the raw, cold data. Nothing more, nothing less. I knew that a professional auditor would be able to see the truth without me pointing it out. I hit the send button at midnight and went to sleep feeling a strange sense of peace. The evidence was now in the hands of people who were paid to be objective. I just had to wait for the process. A few days later, a rumor started flying around the office. I heard from the receptionist that Marcus was being considered for a major promotion to vice president. Leadership was apparently praising his decisiveness in the face of the project's collapse. They liked how he had taken charge and identified the source of the problem so quickly. It was a bitter pill to swallow, watching the villain of a story get rewarded for his lies. My coworkers started treating me even more like an outcast, assuming I was about to be fired to make room for Marcus's new team. I almost laughed when I heard the news. Marcus was walking around the office like he already owned the building, handing out advice and acting like a hero. He had no idea that the files I sent to HR were currently being reviewed by a third-party audit team. The truth was already moving. Suddenly, a second meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. This time, it was held in a different room on the top floor, far away from the usual noise of the marketing department. The tone was completely different when I walked in. The room was cold, and 3 people I didn't recognize were sitting at the table alongside the company's owner. They had the same report Marcus had used to blame me, but they had it printed out with red annotations all over the pages. Marcus was there, too, but he looked less confident than before. He was fidgeting with his tie and looking at his phone every few seconds. This time, the owners didn't ask Marcus to speak first. Instead, they looked directly at me and asked me to explain the timeline of the project from my perspective. They wanted to hear the story behind the data I had submitted. I walked them through the entire process with a calm, steady voice. I showed them the timestamps of the initial project plan and the dates of my resource requests. I pulled up the version history that showed the exact minute Marcus had accessed my computer to delete the safety protocols. My voice never shook once. I presented the email approvals he had sent me, which contradicted everything he had said in the previous meeting. I showed them the warnings I had archived, which he claimed he had never received. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioner. I wasn't attacking Marcus. I was simply presenting a factual timeline that made his lies impossible to maintain. I could see the senior partners exchanging long, dark looks as I spoke. Marcus stopped taking notes and stared at the table, his face turning a strange shade of gray. One of the senior auditors leaned forward and asked Marcus a very specific question. He wanted to know why Marcus had overridden my recommendation about the budget risks on the 14th of the month. Marcus stumbled. He tried to claim he didn't remember that specific email, but the auditor pointed to the digital receipt that showed he had opened and replied to it within 5 minutes. Marcus tried to pivot, saying he was just trying to keep the project moving, but his voice was thin and shaky. He stumbled again when asked about the edits made under my login from his office's IP address. The room went very still. The lies were falling apart like wet paper. Every time he tried to explain away one fact, another one was waiting to trip him up. He was no longer the confident leader. He was just a man caught in a web of his own making. The company owners immediately launched a formal review of the entire department. They realized this wasn't just a single mistake. It was a deep systemic issue involving Marcus's leadership. They hired an outside firm to conduct a full forensic audit of his past 3 years at the company. Not because I had begged them to, but because the evidence I provided was so undeniable they couldn't ignore it. I returned to my desk afterward and went back to work like nothing had changed. I didn't gossip with my coworkers, and I didn't celebrate. I just focused on my tasks, knowing that the wheels of justice were finally turning. Marcus, however, started unraveling. He was seen pacing in the parking lot and snapping at anyone who came near his office. He knew the audit was looking into his hidden files and his secret deals. His wall of protection was finally crumbling down. Marcus stopped speaking to me entirely after that day. He would walk the long way around the office just to avoid passing my cubicle. He stopped making eye contact in the break room and would leave the room if I entered. I didn't chase him for closure, and I didn't try to get him to admit he was wrong. I didn't need his validation anymore. I realized that his silence was the loudest confession he could ever give. My coworkers noticed the change in the atmosphere. They started coming by my desk to ask small questions, sensing that the power was shifting. I remained professional and polite to everyone, but I kept my distance. I had learned that office loyalty can be very fragile when things get difficult. I was content to wait for the final report from the auditors. I knew my name would be cleared, and that was all that mattered. The final audit findings were released 2 weeks later. It was even worse than I had imagined. The report confirmed that Marcus had a long history of unauthorized edits to official documents. It detailed a consistent pattern of misrepresentation to the clients and a habit of shifting blame to junior staff members to protect his own bonuses. They found evidence of several ghost projects where he had pocketed funds meant for resources. It was a complete and total takedown of his professional character. The report was shared with the executive board, and the promotion he had been bragging about was immediately canceled. Leadership called one final meeting in the big conference room. They didn't tell us what it was about, but everyone knew. The air in the building was electric with anticipation. We all filed into the room, but there was one chair at the head of the table that remained empty. Marcus wasn't there when the meeting started. The owner of the company stood up and looked at all of us with a very serious expression. He didn't explain why Marcus was missing, and he didn't need to. Everyone could see that Marcus's name had already been quietly removed from the company directory and the project boards. The owner spoke about the importance of integrity and the need for a culture where the truth is valued above all else. He apologized to the team for the stress of the past few months. It was a strange feeling to be in that room without Marcus's heavy presence. The man who had tried to destroy me was simply gone, erased like a bad line of code. The executives didn't use the word fired, but they didn't have to. His absence was the most powerful statement they could have possibly made to the entire staff. An official email went out to the entire company an hour later. It was written in a neutral, professional tone with very clear language. It stated that the recent project failure had been reviewed and that the errors were found to be the result of senior management decisions, not staff negligence. My name was cleared officially and publicly. The email even highlighted my exemplary documentation as the key factor in resolving the crisis. Suddenly, my phone began to buzz with messages from coworkers who had ignored me for weeks. They were all so happy for me and claimed they knew I was innocent all along. I didn't respond to the fake kindness. I just stared at the email on my screen, feeling the weight of the last 3 months finally lift off my shoulders. Then, I received a private message from the CEO asking if I could come to his office. The CEO sat me down and asked if I would be willing to lead the next phase of the project. He told me they needed someone who understood the system and who they could trust implicitly. He made it clear that this wasn't a favor or a way to make up for what happened. It was a move based on the trust one had earned through my actions and my integrity. He offered me a significant raise and a new title that reflected the work I was already doing. I took a deep breath and said yes without any hesitation. I knew I was ready for the responsibility. I had built the project, I had saved the data, and I had survived the attack on my character. I walked out of his office as the new director of project strategy. I wasn't just back in the game, I was now the one setting the rules for the department. Marcus Thorne resigned that afternoon. There was no big apology to the staff, and there was no final confrontation with me. He just packed his personal belongings into a small box and left through the side exit while everyone was at lunch. He was just gone. I saw him in the parking lot from my new office window. He looked smaller than I remembered. His shoulders slumped as he put the box in his car. I didn't feel a rush of joy or a need to gloat. I just felt lighter. The person who had tried to use me as a stepping stone had fallen off the mountain, and I was still standing. I realized that he had inadvertently given me the push I needed to step into my own power. In trying to bury me, he had actually planted the seeds of my biggest professional success. I turned back to my desk and started planning. I didn't have to scream to be heard. I didn't have to expose him publicly with a dramatic scene in the hallway. I didn't even have to break a single company rule. I simply stayed calm and let the truth arrive on its own natural schedule. I learned that when you have the facts on your side, silence is actually a position of incredible strength. My boss had tried to use his status to crush me, but his arrogance was his ultimate downfall. Now, I am standing somewhere much better than I was 3 months ago. I have a team that respects me and a company that values my integrity. My advice to anyone in a similar situation is simple. Know your worth. Document every single detail. And remember that the truth doesn't need to shout to be powerful. Sometimes, the best way to win is to just let the truth speak for itself.